Good evening, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Hilaal Live. Jazakallah so much for staying with us. My name is Faraz Patel. I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us, and of course, my colleague Lukman Shedrick for taking you through that first part of Hilaal Live. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is among a reduced number of African heads of state at the start of the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg compared to the inaugural event in 2019. Now, this comes as Russia and Ukraine continue to be at war, and African leaders may need to play a very careful role in the relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Joining us now to discuss this is the research director at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies, Dr. Emmanuel Matambo. Dr. Matambo, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Good evening, Faraz. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's quite an honor.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. The honor is ours. So, Dr. Matambo, let's talk with regards to the charm offensive Putin's going to have to play in this. Because on one side, he loves to be the figure in control of so many things. But on the other, he needs allies in this war against Ukraine. So how does Vladimir Putin play this out in this coming weekend?
Well, as you have rightly put it, Vladimir Putin is someone who wants to be at the center of anything. And when it comes to Russia's affairs, and even its both domestic and international affairs, then he wants to be the principal player. But then the only way of playing this out is obviously trying to justify his war against Ukraine, putting a humanistic face, so to say, to the war, rather than letting it appear as though it is an invasion of a sovereign country. Now, there are a lot of ways for doing that. Unfortunately, though, for him, a number of African countries have not really bought into his reasons for starting the war with Ukraine. But first of all, he has to make sure that he reassures African countries that he is indeed not a cynical invader of another country. He has to also pacify and allay the fears of many African countries who are not sure at the moment how long the embargo on grain to Africa might go on, because the African Development Bank has been giving us some cheerless statistics about the cuts in grains that Africa is suffering. So how is Vladimir Putin going to respond to that? That is left to be seen. Another thing, obviously, is for him to follow up, to recap, so to say, what happened at the beginning of June when about 6 African leaders went to Russia and Ukraine to go and negotiate. He has to reassure them that indeed he is putting what they said to him into cognizance.
Yeah, you talk about those leaders that went there at the start of June. So much has changed. And I'm going to touch on one, of course, the North Gauteng High Court's decision. But I want to talk of the grain deal, because that is so key, isn't it? How much of strength does Africa enter this summit knowing that they can try and twist the arm of Putin to take away that embargo of the grain deal?
Well, what Africa has is a force of numbers. It has a lot of numbers, especially at the United Nations. So if Putin wants any form of international support, then it is almost inevitable that he has to pacify, especially the fears of many Africans. Now, when we look at the data from the African Development Bank, I think at the moment we have about 30 million tons in terms of shortages of grain. Now, that is a very big crisis on the African continent, especially if you look at countries such as Djibouti, countries such as Sudan, for example. They 70% of their wheat actually comes from Russia and Ukraine. So you can imagine just how much of a crisis they are in because of this. So Vladimir Putin has to make sure that he listens to Africa, because Africa can actually use its force of numbers at the United Nations to try in as much as they can to alienate Putin from what has been happening. And it happened last year, although major countries such as South Africa, major African countries such as South Africa abstained both in April and in October. But there was a sizable number of African countries that actually condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if I can call it that. And that has actually justified NATO's and America's aggressiveness towards Ukraine, because they know that towards Russia, because they know that we have this big voting bloc that is Africa behind us.
Dr. Matambo, I want to bring the word awkward, because it is going to be a bit awkward for President Cyril Ramaphosa. He goes to St. Petersburg with a lot that has changed, but one most important one, the North Gauteng High Court's decision that if he enters South Africa, the South African government's compelled to arrest him due to that ICC arrest warrant. You then, of course, have President Ramaphosa hosting the BRICS summit next month and just trying to work out things. And you have Putin, of course, who's not going to be attending the summit. Ramaphosa has to play a careful game, doesn't he? Because he enters this thing with kind of a bit of, I won't say egg in his face, but a bit in a weak spot, doesn't he?
Well, internationally speaking, and in terms of optics, Ramaphosa is in a very big dilemma going to St. Petersburg. But then let's just create some context to that. Before the African delegation to Russia and Ukraine in June, one of the conditions that Ramaphosa had put across was that the ICC should suspend its warrant of arrest for the period that our negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are ongoing. So even if Vladimir Putin had come to South Africa, so Ramaphosa would have said, we're not going to arrest him because there is a peace process underway. And one of the conditions we had put on this peace process is that the ICC warrant should be withdrawn. But then, obviously, the fact that by mutual agreement, if I can call it that, they decided that Vladimir Putin is not going to come to South Africa and that he'll be deputized by Sergei Lavrov. There are actually two things that entails. The first thing is that Ramaphosa has actually submitted to the pressure from the ICC and the pressure from the West, especially. The second thing, most disturbing actually between Ramaphosa and Putin, is the fact that if Putin had come to South Africa, Ramaphosa would indeed have arrested him. So now he's, in short, Vladimir Putin's decision not to come to South Africa is quite embarrassing for Vladimir Putin himself, because it actually says conversely that if I were to come to your country, you would indeed have arrested me, which of course, according to Russia's international affairs, would have been a declaration of war between Russia. So Ramaphosa goes into this summit a very, very weakened player, so to say. He has to do a lot of pacifying in Russia.
Dr. Matambo, before we close off the conversation, African leaders, you talk about influence, you talk about pressure. The West is watching this with a keen eye, aren't they? Especially the United Kingdom and the USA.
Yes, indeed. The West is keenly following these things, but then obviously the Russia-Africa summit is a standing thing that has been happening for quite some time now. So people, especially the watching world, would want to see what exactly are the substantial resolutions that will come from this particular summit. And then also as Africa, we, I think, have to really agree on a formula whenever we are interacting with international players. It is not only Russia, it is when it comes to the FOCAC on China-Africa cooperation, when we are conversing with China, the same thing as when we are conversing with Japan through TICAD, the same thing as when we are conversing with the United States on the US-Africa Leadership Summit. We really have to come up with a formula. Do we have to converse with these countries and as individual African countries, or do we use the African Union as a formula? Because as long as we converse with these countries as in silos, then I don't see any substantial change coming out of what is happening in St. Petersburg at the moment. It will just be another photo op for African leaders.
Dr. Matambo, we say thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
That's Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, our Research Director at UJ Center for Africa-China Studies. After the break, the EFF celebrates its 10th anniversary this coming weekend. I chat to one of its portfolio committee members in Parliament, Janet Komane, with regards to that function that will be happening this weekend. To stay tuned.